name is Bonnie Allen. I use the pronouns she, her, and hers. I have been with the New York State Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence for just over 10 years now. Most of my recent work is introducing the Safe and Together model to different systems and training the Safe and Together model one-day overview to child welfare workers across the state of New York. A lot of my other work prior to doing this work at OPDV has been related to the intersections of domestic violence and health, and really looking at how domestic violence impacts health over the course of the lifetime, looking at both behavioral health and mental and emotional health as well. Prior to coming to OPDV, I worked with victims and their children in both residential and non-residential domestic violence programs. Early in my career, my primary responsibilities were making sure that children's needs were being met when they were living in shelter, or if they were getting counseling or therapy, I was providing that counseling to them, perhaps while they were still living in a home where there was domestic violence happening. I find that the Safe and Together model really is an excellent model to address and explain how children are impacted by domestic violence, to show and recognize the strengths of survivors, and also as a way to engage and hold perpetrators accountable. So I'm always excited to have the opportunity to introduce the model to child welfare workers and to all systems. I also worked with perpetrators of domestic violence for many years in an offender accountability program. I've worked with the many systems that are tasked with addressing domestic violence. We know that domestic violence doesn't often show up in a silo, but families that are experiencing domestic violence are also oftentimes experiencing substance use issues or mental health issues. They may be experiencing poverty or living with communities with less resources. And so really looking at all of those different intersections and all of the systems that are working together to address domestic violence and really supporting them and that cross-system collaboration. And the Safe and Together model really promotes that cross-system collaboration. So it's another reason why I like this model so much. I also have I ran a reentry program for people that were coming back into the community after having been incarcerated. I ran a family self-sufficiency program to help people become independent of temporary or public assistance. And I worked at a community dispute resolution center doing custody and visitation mediations. So in all of those positions, although they were not domestic violence specific positions, I found that many of the families that were experiencing challenges, that domestic violence oftentimes was one of those additional things that they were going through, and that often created barriers to successfully using the court system or being able to re-enter successfully back into society or to become financially self-sufficient. So I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to introduce you to this model. I'm going to let Stephanie go ahead and introduce herself now, and then we will move forward.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Thank you, Bonnie. Sorry, guys, I don't have a cool slide like Bonnie. I've been bouncing between different projects and things, so we weren't sure if I was going to be able to make it today. So welcome. Thank you all for being here. I, much like Bonnie, love the Safe and Together model, and I'm very excited to introduce you guys to it today. A little bit about myself. As mentioned, I'm the Assistant Director of Professional Education here at OPDV. Prior to my work at OPDV, I was a victim advocate. I worked primarily with victims and survivors who also had IDD, which is intellectual developmental disability diagnosis, mental health diagnosis, or substance use disorder. Did that for a very long time. Prior to that, I've worked in many of the different systems here in New York State. Like Bonnie, I've moved through the many different systems, never really intending to work with domestic violence, but learning very, very quickly that if you're working with families, if you're working with children, if you're working with people, you are going to be working with people who have or previously had experienced some type of domestic or gender-based violence. So like I said, I've worked in many of the different systems. I've done CPS investigation work. I've worked as a clinician in a secure detention center for at-risk youth. Many times, like Bonnie will say too, I tried to step away from human services. I was like, I'm going to do something different so I don't have to deal with domestic violence anymore. But no matter what I did, I was always interacting with people. When I worked in that detention center with at-risk youth, I would say easily 75% of the kids that I worked with were kids that grew up in homes where there was domestic violence. And so over the many years, I've really truly seen not just how prevalent domestic violence is, but how truly impactful domestic violence is. I've worked in shelters, homeless shelters, domestic violence shelters, like I've worked in social services systems. So I'm very excited today to really bring the intersection of all of the work that I've done into this training to really introduce you guys to the Safe and Together model and what it looks like. and really bring those voices and experiences of the victims and survivors to help us really pull all of this together today. So much like Bonnie, I'm very excited to be here. We really do love this model and are excited to introduce it to you.
And I just want to add, we had done a presentation for OCFS and it came up all the intersections of domestic violence and trafficking and the relevance of the Safe and Together model to people who are doing human trafficking work as well. So
Yes.
that's kind of what brings us all to the table today. And then we have another presentation this afternoon. So let us move forward.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about what we're going to do over the next, hour and 20 minutes or so, hour and 15 or so. So we really kind of packed full this 90-minute session. We want you to be able to leave here with an understanding of the basic overview of what is the Safe and Together model, right? We're going to talk about what are the principles and those critical components of the Safe and Together model. We're going to talk about what is domestic violence informed. Part of New York State's mission and our mission here at OPDV is to really ensure that we have survivor-centered, trauma-informed, and culturally responsive services. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But really, what does that look like, right? And we're going to introduce you to the Safe and Together continuum to help you understand how we can be more domestic violence informed in all of our work. And then we're going to talk about resources for survivors and victims and really look at how do we pull this model in, how do we have those conversations, and what resources are going to be available. So we got a lot to cover, but I promise we're going to get to all of it. Before we continue on, I just want to take a minute and acknowledge that this is going to be a training where we do talk about domestic violence and the intersections with human trafficking this afternoon, but please be mindful that with that, we know that a lot of people come to these trainings with very strong thoughts and feelings around the topic. So if at any point you need to take a break, you need to take a minute, please feel free to do so. We always say that self-care is paramount. We can't help others unless we help ourselves first, right? We have to take care of ourselves so that we can help others. We can't pour from an empty glass. So please, whatever you need to do here this morning, throughout this, even this entire conference, right? Take breaks, make sure you're getting outside, getting some fresh air, you're hydrating, you're eating your snacks. I got lots of snacks here for me, none for Bonnie. But please take care of yourself throughout the day. Additionally, if you would like to talk to anyone, you can always privately reach out to us, but on your screen here on the left-hand side, you'll see the New York State Domestic and Sexual Violence Hotline, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, available in most languages. This QR code right here on your screen will take you directly to the chat line. No matter whether you call, text, or chat, or anyone you may be working with, if you make a referral to this hotline, whether you call, text, or chat, they will always be connected to a live advocate. That live advocate is there for whatever they might need, whether that is to just talk to somebody, to get, maybe it's a family member, to get advice about how to handle something, how to have those conversations. Maybe it's information on supports and services, or maybe it's emergency. Maybe it's emergency safety planning, or even emergency services that somebody might need. That chat line is there, text, call, or chat. That hotline is there for them for whatever they need. Additionally, the Office of Mental Health offers or runs a crisis text line, also 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And you can text 741-741 to be connected to a live advocate with the Office of Mental Health. So I'll leave this on here for about 10 more seconds. Thank you. And they're going to put that information in the chat box as well. But I'll leave this on here in case, just for 10 seconds, in case someone wants to take a quick picture while I sip my coffee. And thank you, Lisa, for putting that information in the chat box as well. So if anybody needs that, you have the picture or you have the chat line. So Bonnie and I mentioned we work for the New York State Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence. We are actually the only executive or cabinet level agency in the entire country dedicated to the prevention and awareness of domestic and gender-based violence. And so how do we do that? We do that through many different ways. First is public policy. We will work with other state agencies, local officials, county agencies to ensure that policies and procedures are survivor-centered, trauma-informed, and culturally responsive. We will then do education and public awareness. We're here today talking to you guys, doing trainings. Bonnie mentioned earlier, we train Safe and Together across the state to the one-day overview. We also really train on the intersections of gender-based violence and any of the work that people might do. We do 101 sessions as well. And then we do public awareness campaigns. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So if anyone is interested, you can check our website. We have a lot of really wonderful public awareness campaigns happening throughout the month, along with some trainings related to domestic violence awareness. And then we work with all of the service providers in New York State to ensure that they have everything they need to help survivors stay safe and move towards self-sufficiency. And you've heard me say survivor-centered, trauma-informed, and culturally responsive. These are the 3 pillars that OPDV operates on, that we want New York State to be when it comes to working with victims and survivors of domestic violence. So survivor-centered, that's really recognizing that the survivor has the right to self-determination, giving that back to them, giving them the freedom to make choices about their lives, their decisions, right? Recognizing that those are the things that have been taken away from them for so long. So we want to give that back to them. We want to give back to them that self-determination. We want to be trauma informed. It shifts from what is wrong with you to what has happened. Promoting compassion and healing. And really ensuring that we're not re-traumatizing anybody that we might be working with. Remembering that everyone responds to trauma differently, and we want to meet everybody where they are. And then lastly, we want to be culturally responsive in all of the work that we do, recognizing that everyone has different intersectionalities, right? We all have different foundational identities, social categories, and meeting people where they are and what they need. An example of culturally responsive that I always give is if you're working with somebody whose primary language is not English, using the translation line, right? Using translation services, having those conversations in a language that they feel safe and comfortable using, that they may feel that they can have more words or articulate in. And that's one of the ways. Maybe it's providing services and supports through a culturally specific provider and really knowing what's available in your area so we can help get people connected with those services that make them feel safest and most comfortable. Did I say anything?
No, I think we're moving right
Awesome.
along.
Any questions or anything before we move in?
I will
Yes,
add
Bonnie.
that the Safe and Together model, these are our 3 pillars at OPDV, but the Safe and Together model aligns very, very nicely with these 3 pillars. So I think that's just another way that the Safe and Together supports the work that we're doing and that our work supports the work of Safe and Together.
Thank you. So now we're going to kind of switch and talk about really what is domestic violence? What does it look like? So this is our technical working definition of domestic violence. So I'm going to read the definition and then break it down a little bit. So domestic violence is a pattern of behavior used by an individual to establish and maintain power and control over their intimate partner. That behavior includes abusive tactics, threats, or actions that may or may not rise to the level of criminal behavior. And it can include physical, emotional, financial, or sexual abuse. So I want to talk about this. I kind of want to break this down a little bit and think about what some of these terms mean. So first off, pattern of behavior. Oftentimes when I say pattern of behavior, people think it means the exact same thing over and over again, right? We go back to like middle school when we learned, ABC 1, 2, 3, ABC 1, 2, 3. We know it's going to be AB, and then the next one's going to be C. But when we're talking about domestic violence, it doesn't necessarily have to be the exact same behavior over and over again. What it means is that this perpetrator is using any behavior that is necessary to gain and maintain the power and control. So today it might be financial abuse, and tomorrow it might be physical abuse. And then we might never see physical abuse from that person to that survivor ever again. So what's important to recognize is that when we say pattern, we mean it's anything that someone is doing to gain and maintain power and control. In this definition, we talk about it being an intimate partnership, right? That it's 2 people who have intimate or social contact, a dating couple, a couple who's in a relationship. Maybe they're married, formally married. Maybe they have a child together. Depending on the system you're working in, it can also depend or expand upon this definition, maybe to include family or household member. And, when we think about it in the work that you do with trafficking, a lot of times victims of human trafficking may be in a relationship with that trafficker. They may also live with that person. And so that's where we see an intersection with domestic violence. And not to plug us, but you can find that out later on this afternoon. And so the behavior includes abusive tactics, threats, or actions that may or may not rise to the level of criminal behavior. This piece is often shocking to people because what we find is you say, oh, it may or may not rise to the level. And people are like, well, wait a second, isn't everything criminal? But not everything associated with domestic violence is criminal behavior. Yes, physical abuse, stalking, strangulation, sexual assault, those are all criminal acts. But some things like reading someone's text messaging, monitoring their phone calls, undermining their parenting, right? That may or may not rise to that level of criminal behavior. And it's important to remember that perpetrators are aware of that, and they will use those behaviors that may not rise to that level in order to control that person, to make their freedom, or to take away their freedom. And it includes physical, emotional, financial, and sexual. So domestic violence really does include a wide array of tactics. And we're not really going to talk specifically about all of these, but what's important to remember is that every situation is going to look different, right? Not every situation is going to be the exact same. The way that someone might, for example, isolate me is probably very different than the way someone would isolate Bonnie. For example, for me, it would be to cancel my gym memberships. I always joke, I love the gym. I'm at the gym all the time. It might be calling and canceling my gym memberships, and that would make me feel isolated from the community. Whereas Bonnie drives everywhere. She's always traveling. She's always going places. So maybe taking her car away would be a way to isolate her, right? So every situation is going to look different. And that's why we really like to talk about domestic violence is this idea of coercive controlling behavior. It is about taking away the other person's freedom, taking away their liberty, taking somebody else's life, taking away the decision making that that victim or survivor has. So coercive control is defined as an act, pattern of acts, threats, humiliation, or intimidation that is used to harm, punish, or frighten. So, I want you to go beyond just the physical abuse, because oftentimes people think, oh, domestic violence is physical abuse. And yes, it absolutely can be physical abuse, but I've had cases that have no physical abuse. It looks at things like the financial abuse, right? Taking away someone's ability to control their own money. There's a pair of brothers, their names are Luke and Ryan, who we work with Safe and Together, and they grew up in a home where there was domestic violence. And they said nobody understood, nobody saw what was happening because they were never physically abused. There was never physical abuse in the home, but it didn't make it any less dangerous. They very unfortunately lost their mother and their sister to their dad's behavior when they tried to move them out of the home. And they talk about coercive control is it's not necessarily what's done to you, it's what you can't do yourself. And I really like the way they talk about it. And they say violence is a subset of control. It's how someone gets that control. And I really like that because it really helps us understand that coercive control is taking away every single decision that somebody else has. And what's important to remember is that this doesn't happen overnight. It happens subtly over a long period of time, right? I always say, if you got punched on the first date or slapped, you're sitting at dinner and someone reaches across the table and hits you, there wouldn't be a second or third or fourth date. Excuse me. And so recognizing that this happens over time, and oftentimes it can look like love or affection, like, hey, let's put things in your name. Let's put the bank account in your name. You have better credit. Or let's put the mortgage in your name. You have better credit, and we'll put it all in one bank account, and then all of the money is taken away. One of the things Luke and Ryan talk about is how their dad used to gamble money away on purpose to keep them poor so that the kids could not engage in activities throughout school or anything like that they couldn't have anything extra for school, that all they could do was get on the bus and come home, right? And if they weren't home at a certain time, they would get in trouble, even though they couldn't control the time the bus came home. And so coercive control is thinking about somebody hiding another person's car keys so that they're late for work. And if that happens 10 times, they might lose their job, or they might get put on a performance plan. And so recognizing how this behavior impacts every area of that victim or survivor's life. And so with that, we'd actually like to engage with you guys a little bit and hear from you. What are some ways that a perpetrator might gain and maintain control? How might coercive control look? What are some examples of that? And use the chat box feature for that. It'll always come to the host and panelists, so we'll see it. We'll share some of those examples and talk through some of them. So please feel free to use that chat box. What are some examples of coercive control? Perfect. Thank you so much. So the first one that came in was withholding legal documents. That is such a great example. And I love that you tied it right into intersectionalities, right? So if we think about, for example, someone's immigration status, if I don't have access to any of my documentation, any of my paperwork, any legal things, I can't do anything. I can't go anywhere. I can't get services. I can't talk to anybody, right? Or, for example, even without immigration status, if someone holds my license, where am I going to go? I can't drive without my license, right? If they hold my birth certificate, my social security card, I can't go to the doctor. I can't apply for services, maybe at social services. So very good one. Thank you. Let me scroll up and just kind of go through some of these. I love this. Keeping family away. Absolutely. Oh, we're not going to your sister's house this Sunday. Or, I hate it when you go hang out with them. You're just not the right, you're just a different kind of person when you hang out with them. Or I've had cases where perpetrators tell the family members, hey, it's the, your daughter gets so anxious when you invite her over. Your daughter gets so anxious when you invite her over, and we can't, it's too stressful for her, so I don't want her to come over. No phone access. That's another great one, right? Tying it and linking it right back to the use of technology, right? Technology is a huge source of how we connect with the outside world, how we, socialize, how we even do our banking, how some of us work, right? We're using technology right now. So by taking away my phone access, you're taking away my communication with my friends, my family members. You're taking away communication with my job, maybe. Cutting off the Wi-Fi is also a piece of technology. Peer pressure, absolutely. If you don't do this, then this won't happen. Or you're so much better when you use drugs. Shaming or criticizing your partner for mistakes. Yes. Berating, belittling them. I can't believe you would do something like that. You're not smart. You don't know what you're doing. Threatening custody of the children or ACS involvement. That's another great one. Absolutely, right? We see this a lot, especially if there are children involved in domestic violence situations. That threat, if you leave, I'll get custody. You think they're going to give custody to someone who lives in a shelter? You think they're going to give custody to someone who can't put a roof over their kid's head? I have this big house and I put food in the fridge. I'll get custody. Or not even just threatening ACS or CPS involvement, but actually calling in those false reports. I've had cases where perpetrators will call in multiple false reports, and that is really going to impact that survivor. And even I've had false criminal reports, police reports, and think about how that impacts their job, right? The time off of work, childcare, anything like that, right? It's going to have this ripple effect on the survivor's life. Controlling all the money, absolutely. Financial abuse is one of the most common tactics that we see in domestic violence situations. So controlling all the money, taking away bank cards, changing PIN numbers and passwords, all of that so that that victim or survivor has no access to the finances. Calling child protective services on them. Yeah, monitoring communication and what you can say and who you say it to. Absolutely. Oh, who are you talking to? Let me just see your phone real quick. Canceling the insurance to stop the child from going to school or stopping other parent to go to the doctor. Yes. Another great example, canceling insurance, threatening to cancel insurance, anything like that, whether it's car insurance or health insurance. Isolating them, no internet, thank you. Any new vehicle, phone is put in their name and they're not allowing the victim to own or do anything with their vehicle or phone. Yes. This is in my name. So if you leave, this is my car. If you try and drive it anywhere, I tell you you can't, I'm going to call and report you for stolen vehicle. Excuse me. It's real dry in this room. But that's a great one. Brainwashing, gaslighting. So gaslighting is when that perpetrator seeks to distort the victim's reality, make them question their own reality, to the point where they have to almost rely on that perpetrator for what is real and what isn't real. And so, oftentimes victims and survivors will question their own reality because the perpetrator has used such severe gaslighting on them, using past things said against them. Oh, do you remember when you said that? Well, now here's this or that. Hiding birth control. Yes. Reproductive coercion is another type of tactic that we see in domestic violence a lot. That sabotaging birth control. So reproductive coercion is when one partner exerts complete control over the other person's reproductive health. So that can be anything from hiding birth control, destroying it, sabotaging it, like poking holes in condoms, refusing to use it, or even forcing someone to get pregnant, forcing them to get pregnant multiple times, or forcing them to terminate a pregnancy or keep a pregnancy against them or their doctor's best wishes. Cameras throughout the house for control. Absolutely. Those cameras throughout the house. Ring doorbells, ADT security. Oh, why is that person at the house? Or why did you just leave? Love bombing and switch and bait. Absolutely. Changing passwords. These are all really phenomenal examples. And that's what coercive control is, right? All of these little things. You know, it's the putting a camera in the house and saying, oh, it's just because I want to be able to see the dog all day. And then all of a sudden being like, well, why is, Bonnie over at the house, Stephanie? What are they doing there? Or why are you leaving? Or I see you put 10 miles on the car, but I know it's only 3 to and from the grocery store. So where did you go today? Or I turned your phone off because you were making too many phone calls, right? It's those things that take away the freedom of that victim and survivor. And so that's what I want you to think about as we move forward through the rest of this training and we really dive deep into the model. I want you to really think about all of the things that perpetrators are doing to not just impact that survivor, but those children too, and how that really not just impacts them in the short term, but that long-term impact as well. Okay, any questions or anything before we head forward? Please feel free. Bonnie and I love to hear from you. We love your questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to send them along to us. There's the Q&A, the chat box. Please feel free to use those, and we'll be happy to answer those questions as they come forward.
So we're going to move in now and talk to you about the Safe and Together model. We wanted to kind of do that overview of our definition of domestic violence and coercive control. The Safe and Together model, when you attend the 1-day overview or the 4-day core training, assumes some basic knowledge of domestic violence. And so we just wanted to make sure we kind of got that coercive control piece in there. From your answers, it seems to me like you have a lot of examples and probably experience, again, because trafficking and the tactics of coercive control are often used both in trafficking and in gave really amazing, great examples. And I think one of the things that the Safe and Together model does is it really moves us away from domestic violence as physical incidents only and moves us to look to a much bigger picture. So we told you what we were hoping to accomplish today. These are the objectives of the Safe and Together Institute when we do this 1 hour briefing of this model. It's to introduce a perpetrator pattern framework. The Safe and Together model really is always moving back to and seeing the perpetrator of domestic violence as the source of risk and harm. It can be so easy when we're addressing domestic violence, particularly for child welfare workers, to become focused on the survivor parent. Oftentimes the perpetrator is trying to avoid systems, is trying to avoid caseworkers. And so oftentimes it's the survivor that is the person that's directly in front of the system. And so then we have this very slippery slope where the perpetrator oftentimes becomes invisible and our attention becomes focused on the survivor. And then that becomes, what is the survivor doing or not doing? And why didn't the survivor do A, B, C, and D? This model, whenever anyone in any system, right, starts to go back to that focus on the survivor and what they did or didn't do, or why they didn't do, or how they failed to protect or keep the children safe, this model is always going to pivot us back to the perpetrator as the source of risk and harm, and to how critical it is that we understand the perpetrator's behavior and that we're looking at the survivor's decisions and choices in the context of the tactics of coercive control that perpetrator is using. Another objective of the Safe and Together Institute is to introduce and understand the Safe and Together model principles and components and how they can guide practice. Again, this is a child welfare model, and so the 1-day overview training and the 4-day core training is designed for child welfare workers, but it is also a cross-system collaboration model. So we really recognize and understand that this model can be applied in any system that's working with perpetrators or survivors and victims of domestic violence. So, and these model principles and components, which we're going to go into detail this morning, they really apply to whatever type of practice. If you're in child welfare, right, it doesn't matter if you're CPS or you're foster care, if you're in family court, right, whether you're an attorney for a child or you're the judge, these components and principles apply to all of the different positions and anybody that's working with or engaging with perpetrators, children, and survivors. And then they introduced the Safe and Together model as a way to enhance child serving systems response to domestic violence perpetration. So again, as the perpetrator is the source of risk and harm, we want to engage with perpetrators. We want to hold them accountable for their actions and their responses and always be pivoting back to them as the source of risk and harm. And this model really helps us to do that. And again, when we're talking about child serving systems, we are talking about the many, many and multiple systems that are engaging either directly with children or are indirectly tasked in some way with promoting the health, safety, and well-being of children. The mission of the Safe and Together Institute is to create, nurture, and sustain a global network of domestic violence-informed child welfare professionals, communities, and systems. I really like their mission because it mentions that we're not only talking about child welfare professionals. We want communities and all systems to be domestic violence informed. And we're going to be introducing you to the domestic violence informed continuum of practice in a little bit. And that really defines for us what it means to be domestic violence informed and encourages us to move away from any practice that is domestic violence neglectful or destructive, and make sure that we are always engaging with families in ways that are domestic violence informed. And that means even oftentimes we may be working with and engaging with families where domestic violence has not been identified. Right? Maybe there's no documented history of domestic violence. Maybe that survivor is afraid to confide in us and tell us what's happening. I always say that perpetrators never walk into a room or a system or an agency and say, hello, I'm perpetrating domestic violence.
Not once.
I've never
30 years,
yeah.
I've never seen that.
I've never seen it happen.
That'd be nice and make our jobs easier.
Yes, I see in the chat box, can you mention the 3 pillars again? It's being survivor centered. So seeing that survivor as the expert in their life and giving them back choices and decisions and listening to them. It's being trauma informed, right? Recognizing that trauma is prevalent in many, many of the families that we're working with. The domestic violence is trauma, so that we're engaging and responding in ways that are trauma informed. And that 3rd pillar is being culturally responsive, recognizing how people's foundational identities of race, culture, religion, ethnicity, what role they may be playing in the perpetrator's abuse and in the survivor's ability to access services and support. So we're going to be always trying to be domestic violence informed. And like I said, even if that person, even if we're working with a family and we have not identified that that is family that may be experiencing domestic violence, we want to, with every family we're working with, because domestic violence is so prevalent, right? The statistics show us that it is happening in, I think, 1 out of 4 women and 1 out of 10 men are experiencing some type of domestic violence. And so we want to always be engaging with families in ways that are domestic violence informed. So even if we haven't identified domestic violence, we want to be giving messages that domestic violence is common, that many people we work with experience it, that we can be a resource and support, that if anyone is ever experiencing domestic violence, it is never the victim's fault. There are messages that we can give always in our communication with families and individuals that are domestic violence informed, even if we're not sure if that family has ever experienced domestic violence. But we're going to go into a lot more detail about that shortly.
And we will put those in the chat box in just a minute, once we can get our keyboards over there. So we'll do it in a minute. But I also want to just jump in, Bonnie, if you don't mind, and just say, you know, one of the things about Safe and Together that I love is they define child welfare as anyone who's working with children. That's pretty much everybody, right? I mean, they really define, if you are working with children, you are part of the child welfare system, because you might be a mandated reporter, right? You might be a part of the school. You might be part of healthcare systems, right? So even if you're not in the child welfare system directly, right? CPS investigation, foster care, prevention, anything like that. If you're working with children, you really are essentially a piece of that child welfare system somewhere. And I really like that they look at it that way, because I think that that's important. Thank you.
Thank you. So Safe and Together really is a global model. It's operating in many states in the United States, Alaska, California, Florida. I believe there are significantly more. This slide is
old. Yeah,
this is an older slide.
I think this is doubled, truthfully.
So many more states in the United States. Stephanie and I trained with people when we became certified trainers, with people from Colorado, with people from, let's see, New Mexico,
Arizona, Tennessee, and Canada.
Yeah, Stephanie always remembers all of the places. And again, other people in our office trained with people from the UK. Yeah. And so this model has really been shown to work in across the globe, right? In many different cultures and many many different states and many different cities. It's being rolled out in different places in different ways. We are very fortunate in New York State that OCFS has adopted the Safe and Together model, and that every single child welfare worker coming in working through OCFS is getting the one-day overview training. And many counties now have the option, all counties have the option now of fully implementing the model and having all of their staff trained. And then the model also provides coaching and technical assistance and consultation for cases where there's domestic violence. Australia has the oldest and largest network of Safe and Together implementation. Their family court system has really adopted the model. It is our hope in New York State that we're getting all of our child welfare workers, but also that in partnership with OCFS, OPDV will be working together with OCFS to introduce this model to our family court system, is high on our list, right? To healthcare providers, to law enforcement, ideally anyone that's responding to domestic violence. If they have the same language and the same understanding of domestic violence, we will be much more effective in keeping survivors safe, keeping children safe, and holding perpetrators accountable. So it really is that cross-system collaboration model, and it is showing that regardless of where this model applies, domestic violence is about power and control, regardless of where in the world it is happening, and this model is put in place to address that.
And thank you, Lisa. She just put in the chat box the 3 pillars: trauma-informed, survivor-centered, and culturally responsive. Thank you.
So I mentioned that we're rolling this model out in New York State, so it's happening in varying and different degrees. Right now, there are 24 counties that have some form of implementation of the Safe and Together model. 5 of those 24 counties have decided to train their entire staff. So the whole of the model is the 4-day core training. And then that, once everyone has been trained in that 4-day core training, OCFS comes and does coaching and consultation. There's also organizational assessment to see kind of where people are at when they start this process, and how policies and procedures and protocols have changed after they have implemented the Safe and Together model. OCFS is currently doing coaching in 8 counties. And then the other ones that have not committed yet to the full 4-day core training and to the coaching, what they are doing is they are kind of dipping a toe in and introducing the model by offering the briefing to different systems in that county. Oftentimes they are doing the 1-day overview, or sending some of their staff or some of their supervisors to that 1-day overview, or sometimes picking select staff to do that 4-day core. But the hope is that ultimately every county, every employee in every county will have had the 4-day core training and have access to coaching and consultation of the Safe and Together model. So you can kind of see where we're at now. None of this is mandatory at this point, right? It is being offered to counties, and OCFS is really doing their best, right? To whenever someone wants that 4-day core, that becomes the priority to make sure that all the people in that organization in that county are trained.
Yes. And like Bonnie mentioned earlier, right? All of the new onboarding child welfare workers throughout New York State. So anyone who's going through the CWFP Foundations Program, Child Welfare for Foundations Program, that's what CWFP is. Sorry, a lot of acronyms here in New York. Anyone who's going through that, who's a new CPS worker, foster care prevention, all get the 1-day overview in their onboarding training. And so even though this says 24 counties at varying degrees, Bonnie and I have had at least a handful of people from every single county getting that 1-day overview as they onboard in. So really this is being introduced across the state, and then these 24 counties are taking it a step further.
And in addition, anytime OCFS or OPDV has the opportunity to provide this 1-hour briefing, like we're doing for you now, yes, we are also doing that. So we've done a lot of that in different counties in their integrated domestic violence courts. We have introduced it. There's a strong starts court initiative. So we're getting ready to introduce the model to them. Any opportunity for any system, we are introducing the model.
Bonnie has started to introduce us to the model a little bit. So what I want to kind of do now is we're going to dive deeper into the model. But before I do that, a couple questions came up in the chat, and I want to make sure that we address all of those questions. So how can we find out about the 1-day or the 4-day core training opportunity? So Katie, that's a really great question. Bonnie and I, you can reach directly out to us. Our information will be at the end of this training, and I believe it was put into the chat at the very beginning as well as our email. You can reach directly out to us. You can send us an email on what you're interested in. OCFS implementation team is the primary team to do the 4-day core. Bonnie and I are the primary team on the 1-day overview training. We have a lot of 1-day overviews actually scheduled throughout the entire year. The core is generally trained regionally or countywide. So like they'll go to Westchester and do a core training in Westchester, and then they'll go to St. Lawrence and do a core training in St. Lawrence. So the 1-day is actually offered virtual. So if you're interested, please feel free to reach out to us and we'll be more than happy to get you all that information for what you're looking for. The next question that came in was, can you clarify, are Kings and Queens counties not utilizing the model, or is it that they are not implementing further than the initiation on it? So if we go back to this one, you'll see that, they're not highlighted, which means they're just not implementing any further than the initial onboarding at this time. That doesn't mean that they are not going to be implementing it at any point, or they haven't started, because we have more and more counties that are coming on board. And again, just like the first one, this really updates weekly. So with that being said, while they're not highlighted here, it doesn't mean that they're not taking any more on, or they're not furthering into the Safe and Together model. And Bonnie, I don't know if you want to speak a little bit more to that specific question, if I missed anything.
So yeah, New York City is kind of they always do things a little differently.
That's true.
They have ACS down there. So at this point, it is not being implemented in those counties. But like I said, we're starting to work with the Strong Courts Initiative. We're starting to work with the Center for Justice Innovation. So it is our hope that New York City will start to, and we have a lot of people from voluntary agencies that have contracts with OCFS.
Yes.
From the city, and those programs are attending the workshops, and we do have occasionally people coming to that 1-day overview from those counties in New York City. But to my knowledge, at this point, none of those counties said we want to fully implement this model and have all of our staff trained. I don't think they're there yet.
Yeah, but we have, I can tell you, we have had Queens and Kings counties in that 1-day overview, especially those other, You're okay. And so another question came in, are we going to have time to actually cover tools in this model? So because this is the briefing, that we don't dive too deep into the actual tools. This is just that introduction to the model. Where we cover those tools will be that 1-day overview and that 4-day course. So we're going to talk about some of them, but we're not really going to have those times to dive deep into them. That's really that 4-day model and a little bit in the 1-day. So thank you all for those questions. Please feel free to keep them coming. And Lisa, thank you for introducing or putting our introductions in there with all of our contact information. So this is kind of that one-stop slide that I like to say is available. It's one of those things where it really introduces you to the Safe and Together model, right? This is really the model on one page, as you would say. So it starts with the foundation. So what is the foundation of the model? That's the characteristics, the principles, the critical components. We're going to talk about those today. We're going to give you the 3 principles in just a minute. We're going to talk about those 5 critical components here in just a little bit. These practice tools that are listed here, those are things that you're going to get in that 4-day core. So these practice tools, for example, mapping, which we're going to introduce you to mapping in a little bit, but the real, mapping the perpetrator's pattern of behavior, that's something that we spend a lot of time on in that 4-day training. Pivoting. So pivoting is really a concept. It's really pivoting away from victim blaming language, which we're going to talk about on the continuum in just a second, moving away from why don't they just leave? Why didn't they just do that? How come they didn't stop it? To what is that perpetrator's behavior and how is that impacting every area of that adult survivor, the family functioning, or negatively harming the child? The case planning grid, the supervisor matrix, pathways and plannings. Again, those are tools that are offered. We do coaching as well. That's offered to those counties that are implementing. So again, these are things that happen in those larger trainings that we dive deep into. Domestic violence informed child welfare systems. That's really what the foundation and the practice tools are leading to. Every system that we interact with, right? So even if you are a CPS investigator, you're going to interact with law enforcement, the legal court systems, right? You may interact with the school systems, medical systems. We want all of the systems that are interacting to be domestic violence informed, because that's going to have improved competencies, really understanding these cases, understanding these families and what they truly need. And we want cross systems collaboration. We don't want siloed systems. We want systems that interact and have conversations with each other so that we can truly help these victims and survivors be safe, help these children heal and be resilient from the things that they've experienced. And what that does is that leads to better outcomes for families. Safety, well-being, and permanency. That's our goal, right? That's child welfare's goal. That's what we want. It starts with having better assessments. How do we better assess for domestic violence on these cases? How do we truly assess for the harm that may have taken place in this home? It leads to better partnerships with that adult survivor that's in the home and the families that we may be working with and other systems. And then lastly, it leads to better case plans. And when I say better, I really truly mean the word effective case plans. It leads to having effective case plans for these families. We want case plans and services in place that they can follow through with, that they can engage in, and that they can move forward towards safety, well-being, and permanency. So a question in the chat, how can I find out what day courses are available to gain information and knowledge about this? Feel free to reach out to Bonnie and myself directly. You can send us an email, not just in here, but if you email us after this, we're here all day today, so we'll respond in the next few days, but we can get you guys a list of the upcoming one-day overview trainings. Or if you're interested in the core, we can get you in connection with OCFS, who will be able to help schedule you for that. And that leads to something called the Domestic Violence Informed Continuum of Practice. So you can actually find a copy of this in that participant guide that was that is going to be put in the chat box right now. In that participant guide, if you go to oh boy, I don't even know what page it's on, but anyway, it's not 14 because that's the overview. That's okay. So it is page 14.
Yes, I think it's page 14.
Oh, this is the one-day overview.
Oh,
This is
sorry.
page, so it's in your, that's okay. It says at the top, domestic violence informed continuum, you can't miss it. So this continuum really looks at where we are in our practice. I find that this is a really great tool to have available to you so that, oh, thank you so much. Lisa's going to put that in the chat box so that we can, so that you guys can access that. So thank you so much, Lisa. So what that is it's the handout is for everything, and then you're looking for the domestic violence informed continuum. So what you'll see on the continuum is 5 columns. So you'll see the 5 columns at the very top of the slide here. So what we want to avoid is destructive and neglectful. We want to move away from the destructive and neglectful side to be pre-competent, competent, and proficient. So you'll see the definition of each one. You'll see what it sounds like. Personally, what it sounds like is my favorite section because I like what it says because it's very tangible. The what it sounds like section really shows me what I might see in somebody's case notes, how somebody might talk about this case if we were having a case discussion or maybe a multidisciplinary team meeting that tells me what someone might say or how they might speak about this case. Then you'll see potential outcomes. And you'll notice that when you're in the destructive or neglectful phase, that those potential outcomes are very negative. Those are things that we don't want. But as we move towards competent and proficient, you'll see those outcomes become more positive, more survivor-centered and trauma-informed. And on the second page of the continuum, what you'll see is every area of the case, working with adult survivors, working with perpetrators, working with children, working with intersections and intersectionalities, and cross-systems collaboration. And so really looking at how we want to be is towards the right-hand side of that continuum. I really like the continuum because I think that it provides a good picture for the work that we're doing. It's a great assessment tool to really stop and say, where am I on my cases? Where could I move to, right? And thinking about where I have improvements. It's a continuum, which means it's very fluid. We may have cases that we feel like we're being really competent, really proficient, and then there may be times where we feel it's more destructive or neglectful, no matter what we do, or we can do everything possible to be competent and proficient on our work. But then unfortunately, you know, a judge might make a decision that's destructive or neglectful, right? And so really understanding that this continuum is fluid, but it really truly is a great assessment tool to help us understand how we can use those three pillars, how we can be more domestic violence informed, how we can be more trauma informed and survivor centered in the work that we do. Really shifting away from that failure to protect or victim blaming to the competent and proficient side, which is that perpetrator pattern based, and really understanding that that perpetrator is the source of risk and harm. They're making a parenting choice in this home to be abusive. And we need to shift our focus and really be behavior focused and say, what is that behavior and that negative impact on every member of this household, including the entire family functioning. And so one of the things I also want to know is it holds, you know, when we think about the right side of the continuum, recognizing that there are two parents, right? These children may have two parents, maybe not always, but they may. And recognizing that we're holding a higher standard for fathers, because the unfortunate reality is that somewhere along the way, mothers have a higher standard, right? Who do we expect to have information on the school or the doctors or their sickness or their medications or their favorite color or who their favorite teacher is? Mom. Our instant reaction is to, oh, well, we got to check with mom. Even sometimes as CPS cases come in, they're labeled as the primary caregiver, and that's automatically mom. And so what this model does is it really holds a high standards for fathers as well, right? That you are a father in this home. You are somebody who is a role model to this child, and you are also responsible for your child's safety and well-being. So that's, another one that I really want to emphasize here is that that's moving towards that proficient and competent, and recognizing that that perpetrator is also, if that perpetrator is dad, but the fathers are also held to a higher standard as well.
And again, as Stephanie was saying, I'm really just repeating what the things that she was saying for emphasis. We really want to move away from that failure to protect. That has been practiced in child welfare for many years, right? Because that perpetrator is often invisible, is not showing up, we're not engaging with them, we tend to then look to the survivor and want to hold them accountable for the perpetrator's behavior. This is really moving us away from that. It's a culture shift. And it will take time, but this model is really supporting moving away from that failure to protect and holding perpetrators accountable for their behavior, and recognizing that children are harmed even if they don't see or hear the violence. And that when we're talking about violence, we're not only talking about physical violence, but we're talking about that coercive controlling abuse, which takes all of the forms that you were sharing with us earlier.
Thanks for bearing with us. And just for the record, we must have lost internet connection or something for this short time, because all of a sudden all these messages come through of all of you telling us that we're breaking up and that it's, that it's freezing. So I do apologize that we didn't see any of that. So if you did ask any questions or anything and we haven't addressed them, please feel free to resend them through, just so that we make sure we address them in case we did miss something in that little blip. I'm going to call it the blip.
So these are the safe and together principles. These are the three primary principles of the model. The first one is keeping the child safe and together with the non-offending parent. When we're talking about safety, we're talking about not only physical safety, but emotional safety. We're talking about how is that survivor parent, that non-offending parent, helping the children to heal from the trauma of domestic violence. We recognize that experiencing domestic violence, either as a child in a home where it's being perpetrated or as an adult survivor, you have experienced trauma, and that we know that what helps children and anyone really heal from trauma is stability and nurturance and connection to one positive, supportive adult. And oftentimes that positive, supportive adult is that non-offending parent. And so we want to look at all of the ways that that non-offending parent, in the context of the perpetrator's behavior, is trying to provide safety for the children, is always attempting and working with the child to mitigate the damage done by the perpetrator's behavior. And what are all of the ways in this very chaotic environment, right, where the perpetrator is in control and limiting the choices and decisions that the survivor has, survivors, in spite of that, still oftentimes able to provide nurturance for their children. The Netflix series Made provides great examples of how, when a survivor is in the process of leaving, all of the things that they do, even if they're sleeping in a subway station or a ferry station overnight, What is that survivor doing in that situation that was caused by the perpetrator's behavior to make that child feel safe? They're singing them the same bedtime song that they did. They make sure that they have their comfort object with them. They're continuing to tell them that they love them and connect them with family and try to do fun things, even when they're experiencing homelessness and financial abuse and don't have access to resources and support. So keeping child safe and together with the non-offending parent, that is that first principle. Partnering with the non-offending parent as the default position is the second principle. We're encouraging the model really it's efficient, it's effective, and it's child-centered. This goes back to that survivor-centered pillar that we were talking about earlier. The survivor knows better than anyone, right? What's going to put them at risk, what's going to cause additional harm to their children, what's going to keep them safe. And so we want to be partnering with that survivor as an expert in their life and not telling them what they need to do or what they have to do, right? Because then that's going to seem very familiar to them to what the perpetrator's done, right? The perpetrator has taken away their ability to make decisions and choices. We do not want other systems taking away their ability to make decisions and choices. We want to be trusting them, partnering with them, offering them options, allowing them to make decisions and choices, trusting that the decisions and choices they are going to make around safety are going to be the best ones for their family, themselves, and their children. It's effective because, again, they have a lot of information. When we're talking with child welfare workers, we say that non-offending parent can tell you what the children's relationship is with the perpetrating parent. They can tell you the strengths of that perpetrating parent. And sometimes people are like, oh, perpetrators have strengths. Yes, some of them do, right? Some of them may be really good at showing up at baseball games or reading to their children at night or financially providing, whatever it is, right? Survivors can tell you what those strengths are, and that can help you in your engagement with perpetrators, right? Approaching them and recognizing we understand that you have some strengths.
Right.
And so it's a child-centered approach to partner with that non-offending parent, and it's efficient and it's effective. They're going to be able to give us the most information about what's going to keep that child safe. The third principle is intervening with the perpetrator to reduce risk and harm to child. For so long, so many systems don't engage with perpetrators. They can be scary. It can feel unsafe. They're oftentimes trying to avoid us. Sometimes we're trying to avoid them, right? So sometimes dealing with that perpetrator, it's easy to just say, oh, I couldn't get in touch with them. I didn't have the ability to engage or interact with them. This model requires that we recognize that they are the source of risk and harm. They are the one causing harm to their family. Therefore, we need to engage with them. We need to engage with them as a parent. We need to help them to understand that when they are being abusive to their intimate partner or the parent of their child, that they are causing harm not only to that survivor, but to their children. So we want to engage with them as a parent and let them know you're making a parenting decision that's causing harm to your children when you choose to be abusive to your intimate partner. We want to always be holding them accountable. Perpetrators are extremely skilled at blaming, minimizing, denying, right, at manipulating systems. So we want to always be not allowing any excuses for their behavior. It's not because you drank. It's not because you used drugs. It's not because you were angry. It's not because you were stressed, right? Those things may play a role, but they are not the underlying cause. So we want to educate perpetrators. You're making a decision. It's a decision that's causing harm to your children, and there's no acceptable reason for that. And we want to then offer solutions and strategies and support to change their behavior. One of the ways that the Safe and Together model, I think, is really skilled at holding perpetrators accountable is in terms of their documentation. In the 4-day core, you get an entire day on documenting these cases. And what it's really asking us to do is, even if we never lay eyes on that perpetrator, right, they avoid us successfully, maybe for months at a time, right? Maybe they've already separated from the survivor. Maybe there's an order of protection in place, so they're not even seeing the survivor and the children. We still need to engage with that perpetrator. If that perpetrator successfully avoids us, we can still hold them accountable in our documentation. So we're going to reach out to, let's say Mrs. Smith is the perpetrator. We're going to reach out to Mrs. Smith to discuss the health, safety, and well-being of her children. Mrs. Smith is never going to call us back. Every single time we call Mrs. Smith, we are going to leave a message. This is Bonnie Allen calling from CPS. I'm calling to arrange an appointment and to discuss the health, safety, and well-being of your children. Please call me back at this email. Every single time Mrs. Smith does not answer our call or call us back, there's going to be a note. And Mrs. Smith, who we have never seen, is now going to be very visible as never responding to 20 phone calls or missing 15 appointments to discuss the health, safety, and well-being. When Mrs. Smith walks into family court and says, I would like full custody of my children, she hasn't been invisible. It's very clearly documented that she has not been willing one time to return a phone call or show up to discuss the health, safety, and well-being. That is a way for us to help the courts hold Mrs. Smith accountable. It's a way for us to hold Mrs. Smith accountable. And using this safe and together model, and we do the same thing through our case plans, very behavior-based case plans, so that when that perpetrator is not following the plan that was put in place, it's very easy to document and show that. And so that third principle is intervening with the perpetrator to reduce risk and harm to the child in the ways that I was just discussing. Again, any questions or comments, you can use the Q&A, whatever's, we want to make
Chat
sure
box,
that
yeah,
we're
whatever.
answering anything as we go along. So those are the three principles. These are the really shows us all of the things we need to know about a case or a family to have a clear and accurate picture of what's happening in that family. And these are all of the things that we want to be including in our documentation. What is the perpetrator's pattern of coercive control? What are all of the tactics that that perpetrator is using currently, has used with this family in the past, and has used in previous relationships or previous connections with children, maybe with another partner? We want to be very, very detailed about all of the tactics that that perpetrator is using. We don't want to just say, you know, Mr. Smith engages in financial abuse. We want to talk about Mr. Smith interferes with Mrs. Smith's ability to get to work every day. Because of Mr. Smith's constant calling and showing up at Mrs. Smith's job, she has lost 3 jobs in the past, right? We want to be very specific and detailed about the types of financial abuse, how they're isolating their partner, how they're using the children to undermine the survivor's authority. What threats are they making, right? Very clear, detailed information about the perpetrator's pattern of behavior, not just in whatever incident maybe brought them to us, but over the course of time. So they call it a 360-degree assessment of the perpetrator's pattern of behavior, and gathering information from child welfare, from law enforcement. Are there domestic incident reports? Have there been orders of protection? Have they violated orders of protection? Have they been to offender accountability programs in the past? Right? All of that information. Next, we want to make sure that we are aware, we know that there's so many intersections of domestic violence and child abuse and neglect. We want to know all of the actions that that perpetrator has taken that cause direct harm to the children. And again, we want to be very detailed in how we're documenting that and in doing our homework to get all of the information in the ways that that perpetrator has caused direct harm to the children. We want to really identify and make sure we're documenting the full spectrum of the non-offending parents' efforts to promote child safety and well-being. I mentioned earlier that survivors are oftentimes, my experience is almost always, almost everything they do is to try to keep their children safe and mitigate the damage that the perpetrator is causing. And so we want to look at their choices and decisions in the context of the abuse that that perpetrator is perpetrating. Right? Because if that survivor is able to get those kids up and ready for school every day, if that survivor is able to get them to doctor's appointments and meet their most basic needs, while there's a perpetrator trying to constantly interfere with that, while they're constantly being told they're worthless, they're no good, they're being spied on, they're being stalked, they're being questioned, they're being harassed. Right? They may be forced to, that are using, and it's incredibly, to me, how resourceful survivors often are in still meeting all of the needs of those children while they are experiencing the domestic violence. We want to know, what is the impact of the perpetrator's behavior on the child? So when we go back to that perpetrator's pattern of coercive control, and we have kind of detailed out all of the tactics that that perpetrator is using, what is the impact of those tactics on it? These are important in understanding the role that race, gender, ethnicity, culture might play in the perpetrator's behaviors. We also want to know, what is the role of substance abuse, mental health in in the perpetrator's behaviors, right? Maybe that perpetrator has caused the survivor to have a mental health or substance use issue, and then they're using that mental health or substance use issue as a tactic of coercive control. So if we can fill in these 5 with the court system, with our supervisors, with anybody we're making referrals to. Okay, I'm gonna turn it back over to Stephanie now.
Thank you. So as Bonnie mentioned, there's this concept or idea within Safe and Together called multiple pathways to harm. And it's really looking at the fact that this perpetrator's behavior is going to have a negative and harmful impact on this child. It may not impact on the child. And so what you really want to start thinking about is, how is that child being impacted? Now, maybe that child is a victim of physical abuse. Maybe they are seeing or hearing the violence, so they are going to be impacted directly by that perpetrator's behavior. But there's also indirect impacts. For example, if the perpetrator, if their abusive behavior is directed towards the adult survivor and it's impacting their parenting, that's going to have a negative impact on the child. For example, if that survivor has depression and the perpetrator is throwing their medication away, the perpetrator is not allowing them access to services and supports, maybe that means that they're unable to get up in the morning, or that they don't get out of bed and they can't make sure their child has food or gets on the school bus or does their homework. Maybe it's a loss of authority because that adult survivor, their parenting has been undermined, and so the children don't listen to them, or they talk back, or they run away, or they steal. Maybe that survivor has to address that perpetrator before they can address the children. And so the children's needs are not met directly. But there's also the effect on the family ecology. If that perpetrator is sabotaging the victim's financial stability or their job, as Bonnie mentioned earlier, there's going to be a loss of income, which means that that loss of income is going to impact the child. Maybe their basic needs aren't met. Maybe they, that they don't have winter clothing, that they don't have school supplies, or they can't play a sport because of that. Maybe it's housing instability. They're constantly moving and they're never in one place more than a couple of months. Maybe it's loss of contact with friends and family, extended contact, extended family contact, community members, even members of religious communities or, cultural communities, losing that contact, right? We know that children are resilient, but it takes a safe, stable, supportive adult. We want that to be the non-offending parent, but we also want other adults in their life helping them. And then educational and social disruptions, right? If they're constantly moving, or they're missing school, or they have isolation and they don't have that socialization, they're going to fall behind, or they're going to feel alone. Maybe it's going to lead to depression or anxiety. So we want to look at what's that harm. Is it behavioral, emotional, social, educational, developmental, or physical? So you think behavioral, are they acting out? In teenagers, we often see gang involvement, teen promiscuity, drug and alcohol use. Is it emotional? Is there a mental health component to this? Is there PTSD, depression, anxiety, even self-harm or suicidality? Is it social? Are they lacking friends? Do they feel isolated? Is it educational? Are they missing school? Are they falling behind due to this? Is it developmental? We know that children have developmental milestones. Are they making those developmental milestones, or is there direct physical injury? And I want to be clear that physical injury doesn't necessarily mean a broken bone. It could, bleeding, anything like that, but it could also mean a lack of medical care. Could be a physical injury, right? A lack of treatment for sickness could be a physical injury as well, because that can manifest in physical ways. So really understanding that physical injury also could relate back to medical things as well. So let me ask you guys this quickly in the chat. How do children become aware of domestic violence in the home? They see it, they hear it, they witness it. They're in the room, they hear it from bed. They see it, absolutely. They witness it simply by being there, observing, seeing. There's physical signs. Maybe that mother's the victim and they see that they have broken bones or black eyes. Education, absolutely. They feel it, the vibes change. They feel that someone's upset or hurt, right? They see that survivor crying, witnessing it, learning it in school that it is not a normal family activity, maybe going to a friend's house and saying, wait, this is different than my house. Sometimes they have to call the police themselves, or sometimes the police arrive to their house and that's how they find out, right? They hear it from hearing parents talking on the phone or to other adults venting to get help. Absolutely. Seeing it in the home or even on social media. Absolutely. So there's a lot of ways that children can become aware of the domestic violence in the home. So what are some ways that we've seen children impacted by that domestic violence? How have you seen in the work that you've done or even news media shows, how have you seen children impacted by domestic violence? Yeah, thank you. So someone said in the chat, sometimes they may not know it's abnormal. Absolutely. Absolutely. Sometimes they think that is the norm. They're scared all the time. They have behavior outbursts, children acting out in school, depression, anxiety, hypervigilance. Yes. Some male youth tend to become violent, thinking it's normative to treat their significant other that way, or even acting out in school. When you have like little kids who are 3, 4 years old, they might be fighting a lot, even with toys. Anxiety, PTSD, bullying. Thank you. That's a huge one. Oftentimes, kids who are in homes where there's domestic violence are kids who get bullied because they don't have the new and cool clothes. They don't have the technology, or they're wearing, dirty, raggy clothes, or they don't have money for lunch, so they get bullied, or they bully other children because that's what they see at home. Very good. They become argumentative towards siblings, parents, aggressive towards pets. Absolutely. Go ahead.
Do you want to finish up?
Well, I was just going to kind of round it out and just say, it's important to recognize that children are going to be impacted by the domestic violence, even if they don't see or hear it, even if they're not, directed directly in the room when it happens, even if they are young little kids. We know that children